Hello and welcome to ClapperCast. I'm your host as always, Carson Timar, and today, to celebrate Noir November, myself and Mr. Editor-in-Chief Jak-Luke Sharp are having a Fritz Lang double feature. Looking at some of the director's 1940s noir works, we have a double bill today as we review not only The Woman in the Window, but also Secret Beyond the Door. These are two very interesting films in Lang's filmography, and today we not only dissect each film individually, but also really break down Fritz Lang's artistic style and his filmography as a whole. This is a director that we have a lot of love for, and today we really dive into the historical context of the director and why we think he is so special, even if maybe we're not the biggest fans of the actual films we are watching today on the podcast. This should be a very fun episode. I'm really excited. We have two films to get into, so enough of an intro. Let's get to our Noir November Fritz Lang double feature. Okay, Jack, and to start our Fritz Lang Noir November double feature, we might as well start all the way back 1944, The Woman in the Window. I will start us off because in these double features, there's a running theme, I think specifically back to our James Whale episode, where we'll have two films that we're talking about. One really entices me. I really love it. Wow, that's really fantastic. And then one that's there. It leaves a little bit cold. And for me, that was The Woman in the Window, not to be confused with the Amy Adams film from 2021, I want to say. It's not that this film is bad. It tells the story of a woman who meets this guy. They end up accidentally committing a murder, and then they have to cover up the murder. It's just like so resoundingly simple for both the genre it belongs to and the actual narrative form it is taking on. It really is just like the most standard narrative I think you can imagine with this. Even for 1944, you will look back at old cinema and say sometimes at least that's like building a foundation that the rest of the genre is going to build off of. I feel like for even 1944, this feels very simplistic, building to an ending, which I'm not going to spoil. I'm not going to spoil for everyone, but it's an ending that does literally just next to nothing for me. The conflict in this film continually is not resolved by characters' actions, but rather just random things happening in a way that I didn't find very satisfying. I didn't find very enticing. I think the filmmaking here is pretty, again, average. You wouldn't point to this as being a disaster or Fritz Lang doing bad work, but I could not really imagine watching this and getting a lot of inspiration from it either. It feels very much so like Fritz Lang is just kind of going through the motions here, which isn't the worst thing. But I really struggle with this one. I have a feeling our conversation on this one might be a little bit quick even because I just struggle to find much here to fully dissect and pull apart. But I would love if you would present a beautiful thesis on this about why I'm overlooking a masterpiece.
How in depth are you into the Fritz Lang thing then? Is this the first thing you've probably seen, or?
I've seen, like, obviously Metropolis. I've seen You Only Live Once or whatever that one is. Right. I've seen a few. I've seen M. I'm not like deep into it, but I'm not oblivious to it all.
So the irony here is I know a lot about Fritz Lang, and I haven't seen a lot of his work. So I haven't actually seen any of the ones you spoke about. I have seen Ministry of Fear. I watched that last November. So for anyone out there, these two are going to kick off my Noir November letterbox as well. So I couldn't be more thankful for you to have like a really good chat about these two. I'll start with this. I think there's two directors of a certain period of time who were evolutionary in the form of cinema, who do have a standard that people discuss them to a certain degree as, but I think it's sort of fallen away before long in this new generation we have, or definitely since the 80s and 90s, it's formulated to something else. Those two people, the first one is Orson Welles, and the second one is Fritz Lang. I think that what these two were doing with the form at that time is unprecedented. And I think there's probably Kurosawa there as well, but that's in narrative. But these two with the camera, and granted, I'm probably missing quite a few here. I think you've got Billy Wilder, you've got a few others, James Whale and stuff like that. But how these two actually formulate the camera here within editing and using the camera to make thematic and make tone, I think is just unprecedented. I think the issue with Fritz Lang is, and we'll talk about that in here as well, he's a German native, comes over before the war, doesn't particularly settle very well, and a lot of it people don't like working with him for a multitude of reasons. Partly because he's German, secondly partly because his work ethic, which we'll probably touch upon. And with Orson Welles, I found that he became a caricature of himself in the 70s and 80s, of which therefore his sort of, it's terrible to say, but his output was ultimately reduced due to that. And I think it's going to happen to Tarantino as well before long. But that's another story entirely. This one's interesting because I think you not. This is not going to drag you at all. I'll say we just for the sake of putting myself into this. I think we could not have picked two of the most middle ground Fritz Lang features as well. I think like from all of this filmography, because Ministry of Fear is outstanding, and this is. I find this out of the two. I'll spoil it. I like this a lot more, but I agree with you. I think for like 3/4 of this, I'm like, this feels like a very much a middle ground Hitchcock feature. And granted, Hitchcock is not the be all and end all of suspense. That being said, in this time frame, you ultimately have to compare the two, the contemporaries. And there's nothing that really sets this aside from anything. There's no interesting camera work for a long time. There's nothing insipid about it and the undertones that Hitchcock was managing to do. I'm a really big fan of Edward G. Robinson as well. I prefer Cagney, but I've always quite liked Edward G. Robinson. He's excellent in a film called Seconds, what I did last year, where he accidentally kills a construction worker and he goes on the electric chair. Oh, it's like for like 1930 something. Fascinating, really brilliant actor. I just think this is a little bit tepid. I don't know if you would agree with that. I feel like it wants to like touch its get its toes in the water, and it was like, oh, I just don't think I'm ready for the swim. And the issue is that like the final 5 minutes of this film actually do something. I'm like, he's no, like that's has he really done that? And then there's a bit of camera trickery that he does, which I think is also fascinating. I think it comes too little, too late. I agree with you. I think it's a factor of this is a good film that never goes to great. I know that we say that. I know that's an easy description, but I feel like it's so appropriate with this. I'm just waiting for this to get into second gear. You know, we see him drive through the town, and there's all those little moments. I think Hitchcock would have played so much of that tension. Lang seemingly just doesn't want to have that conversation, which I thought was interesting. And then you get to where he abandons the body, and he cuts back to the tread marks. I'm like, oh, suspense, and you get the mark on his arm that he. There's all these moments where I'm like, and and he sort of deflates everything. And when I got to the end of the film, and again, I don't want to spoil it for anyone else because I think this is a worthy feature to watch. I felt like there was going to be this retroactive reconditioning of the feature, like, oh, the reason because of that is because of this. I don't think that subscription works here at all. I just think it's very flat. I think it's a nothing burger, as you Americans like to say. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but people say that. I don't know, but it just feels like a nothing. It feels like, oh, okay, interesting. It doesn't feel like it takes on that next evolution. And there's some good performance here. I think that Edward G. Robinson is like, from watching his work, never gets out of first gear, which I also thought was very strange. That being said, I do think I have to try to remember her name. Joanne Bennett, who actually works with him a lot after this with Fritz Lang. I think she's the only actress to work with him 5 times, which is crazy. I know Edward G. Robinson worked with him a few times, especially at the Scarlet Letter, which is after this. But even then, it's just very tepid. But I'll throw it back to you. Well, actually, do you from Fritz Lang? I'll enter it with a question. When you look at the likes of his German work, which we can't really describe here because it's like chalk and cheese, when you see this in a contemporary era, at the time, at the period, at the contemporary era at the time, such as the Hitchcocks and the Billy Wilders and your Orson Welles and so on, and like you've got your James Welles and so that's a bit beforehand. Do you see this making a dent? Do you think this is any form of interest then, or do you think it's flat then, flat now? Do you think this is where do you see it hitting at the time?
I definitely wouldn't say flat now. Let's just be clear. I think Fritz Lang carries this wonderful, especially in those earlier German works. As you're still in this like really early portion of cinema, this wonderful blend between now we're starting to establish what cinema can be while carrying some like the wonder of what you can do with the camera that was really present in some like the very, very early silent short films. Um, at the time, I mean, it's also like I mean, there's a million like politics things. You mentioned German expression at the time is very interestingly handled. Also, just different factors as far as are these films actually being shown, but very impactful. I mean, and also just very like different. It's a very singular voice, especially in those German expressions, which is one of the reasons I think as you follow Fritz Lang's career and he goes to America and he starts to do more of these grounded works. You just hear a lot less about them. They're a lot less exciting. They're a lot less interesting, a lot less noticeable or notable. I know Nick is a huge fan of his German work, and from what I've seen, which I haven't seen everything, is like wonderfully, not just like creative on a visual level, but very thematically rich also in a way that I don't necessarily see with a lot of his later career works, which is what it is, but still very, very like worthwhile pictures to go back and watch if anyone hasn't watched them. I will say, just speaking to the programming of this episode, you want to do the Noir November
Yeah.
Fritz Lang thing, and I was like, great, love that. We haven't talked about Fritz Lang, love it. Trying to program, because in an ideal world, I think the best case scenario is neither you, myself, or the Italian has seen any of the
Yes.
films,
Yeah.
and y'all do so many watches. Nick especially watch like everything good, so you have to scroll down to like level 3 of his letterbox like filmography, and I'm like, yeah, I guess these two will work. So definitely, I don't think we're programming this as being like two of his best features. We'll get to the next one in a minute, but I agree. I think that even though for me the sense of tension, the sense of paranoia, like these are very obvious things to draw into this to give like almost an Edgar Allan Poe like sense of poeticness of like you have that intensity that you killed someone and you can see all these little remnants of it. You know, there's people who saw it. I just feel like Fritz never draws that out. He plays this one very, very safe. He never draws out that like vileness, that venom. He never draws out that paranoia. It is very, very just flat. Even as people start to like try to take advantage of the situation and start to be like, well, if you give me money, I won't speak. It's always just very dry, even as like the plans get darker and darker. Like, I don't know, for me, this one really just everything about it felt like it was at such a surface base level. And there were never these grand waves of emotion or fear or tension or anxiety. And it's just, especially for a noir feature or just a film with this narrative, it's something you would want to see. You'd want that expression and you would want that pull. And I just feel like this film is so flat, even just filmmaking wise. I think Fritz Lang is one of the most brilliant people behind the camera that probably would ever exist. And in this film, there's just so little here to really showcase that outside of like a couple key moments. It feels to me like if I just were to watch this film with no context, I would never identify this as being Fritz Lang in a way that I find very sad and very frustrating. I don't know the full story behind it. I'm not as deep on his life than you are. I don't know if he needed money. He was trying to make a feature that was just commercially successful. I don't know where this birthed from. But this really, to me, just felt like a director going through the most basic motions of filmmaking, not in a way that's disastrous, but in a way that is super uninspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think one of the cardinal sins here, from and especially in the context of a Fritz Lang feature, is how visually. I know we can keep on saying flat and timid, but just non-existent like visual aesthetic is here. Like there's, it very much feels like I'll say this is going to be a backhanded compliment. This feels like it's a decade older than it actually is. Like this feels like it's from the 30s, not 1944. When you compare this with Ministry of Fear, the same year, it is astronomically different. The camera work there's crane work, there's like wonderful production design in that feature. It's thrilling, it's scary. It has social commentary about a spy coming in with German secret agents and stuff in the I believe it's in the UK. It has a little bit of fun and wit to it. And then you compare it to this, and I'm genuinely perplexed. It's from the same creative team, or at least from the same creative team as an auteur. To me, the biggest sin here, bar that it's visually uninspiring, is the screenplay. To say this is contrived would be an understatement. This is a feature, and this is where I'm going to have to touch upon the ending here a little bit, which is what I tried to say in my opening. This feature writes itself so neatly; it's actually unbelievably like toxic. At one point, you get to a point where people just constantly talk, which is not an issue, but there's no suspense because they're verbalizing sort of like this an external. To me, in a noir, I like the fact that you have your central narrative, which is narration, which we'll get on to the next film with that. But I like that there's a layer of suspense that we get a narrator that we necessarily may not be able to trust. There's going to be some things that go along. We're going to be withheld information. Here, I think everything is just spoken aloud. Everything is told to the viewer, but also how the narrative works out, it takes no risks. It works itself so nicely, and then you get into that final act. I'm sat there thinking, this is wrapping itself so neatly, and then when you get to this ending, which there's one part of this film where I'm like, oh wow, and I don't know if you noticed it, but when the camera zooms out of Edward G. Robinson, and there's like a in-house trickery cut where then they zoom in, the background and his suit are changed on camera. That's not editing. That's in-house. And then it backs away and he wakes up. I don't want to spoil the repercussions of it, but that's actually an in-shot take, which to me was fascinating. But it's 20 seconds of a 100-minute feature. To me, that's for a Fritz Lang feature. That sort of speaks volumes. And you have this sort of twist, and I was like, oh, we're going to recontextualize a lot of the narratives that happened here. And he just doesn't do it. And I was like, oh, am I sort of reading into this a little bit more than the material is expecting me to, or is it just as mundane as I thought it was? And I sort of sat there for like 10 minutes afterwards, just like snacking, and I sort of think to myself, I've not really put much into this feature, and I don't really think the writer has either. I don't think it's me misreading the recontextualization of the feature. I just think there's such a lack of ingenuity, or at least interest in its own property. There's so many twists and turns here that just are. Edward G. Robinson sat with someone, and this person just lingers on him for an uncomfortable amount of excess seconds, and then bats away. And it happens about 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. And after a while, it's the same thing. It's the same thing, and it's just there's no sort of pardon the pun here. There's not any dreamlike quality to it at all anywhere. So again, I have to agree with you. There's just this mundane nature to it all, which is kind of really weird because it tries to do something with its finale, and to me, that is the basic screenwriting idea. It was like, well, nothing really mattered anywhere, there's a shock twist, and also I think that, like you said, if anyone's actually watching this, no one's going to rewatch this for a long, long time afterward because there's going to be reruns and stuff, but there's not going to be what we can do now. And I think that people sort of that might be effective at its time of a twist. I thought it was a bit ballsy that they were going to do that on screen. They were going to essentially kill someone off in the way that they did, especially to be a male, because that's usually in these type noirs a very femme fatale type of a technique, where like poisoning and stuff like that, nice poisoning. It's usually like the gun and stuff like that with the male. And I was like, oh, that's quite graphic for its time anyway. And then it just pulled itself back onto that as well. There's all these things where it's like 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back. I
hated the ending of this. I don't know how you are. It sounds like you're more open to it. As soon as you get the actual twist, past the scene you're talking about, I thought that was
go on, because I'm
fuck this movie.
Go on.
Because I'm waiting this entire film, and you mentioned there's twists and turns. It's almost hard to register because of the voice this film has. Even registering them as twists and turns, there's very little drama that pull. It's like that meme of the guy sitting up. That never happens in this. So I'm never like, wait a minute, that's a twist or turn, or that's a fucked up idea. That never happens in this. So you're just waiting, and then at least you get some sense of consequence with that, with how the ending appears and with the poisoning and stuff. And then it just again pulls the rug out of it under itself, and it's just at least in this film that I find very boring, I find to have very little emotional impact, it left me with this note of like, okay, there's some venom here. There is some like, there's something there to hit me, to leave an impact. And then it pulls it. And I appreciate what you're mentioning, that at the time, I think it really would have been more shocking and worthwhile as a twist to help give this film something. But especially now with how almost like cliched that is, it really just like, I was like, what's the point in this movie? The experience is
Yeah,
not fun. And then it undercuts its own, like the one thing it does that leaves an impact, it undercuts. So it's like, I don't know. Why am I here? Why am I watching this?
yeah.
Why would I watch this again? I don't know.
The way I try to describe it for the viewers out there, the listeners as well. Think of it like this: it's like someone keeps on. Someone has got you a surprise present, right? But no one's told you. You know you've got a surprise present, and they lead you into like a room, and there's meant to be like a big gift there, and everyone goes, "Oh, surprise!" and the lights go up, and it's no one's there. It feels like weirdly appropriate to compare the two. I think it's giving you like this shock, but there's absolutely no resolve to it either because it doesn't recontextualize anything. It like you said, the sting is taken out of everything here. The resolve, it's nothing of it, and it's sort of this narrative twist that doesn't twist anything. It's just like gotcha. And watching a feature that's building up to something very mundanely and very much in such a very tiring pace, it almost feels like, it's terrible to say, but you want to get this over with at this time. And I think you're waiting for that last piece of 5 minutes where this story sort of concluding, where you think where it's going to go. And you get to like this quite dark and almost really quite tragic aspect of like this professor just seeming like he's just not willing to go to prison for these crimes and he's going to do essentially what at the time would be like a coward's way out, which again, there's a contemporary confusion about it. It's not nothing representing now, but I think it gives this idea of like, oh, like he's not even gonna, he's just gonna do this, and we show the action on screen and we get the phone call. And there's a little bit of suspense there, and there's a phone call again, and the camera just pans right, and he's there, and you think, oh my god, like everything's sort of like fine now, but he's taken that turn, like, and I was like, oh wow, it's quite ballsy, if you'd say so. But like you said, and not to just like describe it out loud, but there's sort of that energy there. There's that little bit of weight where we're going to leave on this quite impacting, dour, sour thing where we've watched someone do these horrid actions and try to cover them up, and yet they've sort of got away with it, but at the cost of their own lives. I'm like, oh, I find that quite an interesting like aspect to this feature. It's not brilliant, but I do find it somewhat rewarding. But like you said, it's a very strange idea to do what they do afterwards and try give like this second wind twist, and then try to add a little bit more, not necessarily nuance, but weight towards going down the street and there's bumping into these people. It feels like something like J.J. Abrams, like Lindelof would do. It really does take that sting out of something where it can be quite impacting, and it's such a whimper, isn't it? It's just not a downer. It's just a whimper of a feature, especially from a director who I would. I mean, you bear in mind at the same time you've got Rebecca, you've got Laura. I think Laura's 1946, which has got a really interesting sort of twist to the events here. Rebecca's vile of its twists, incredible for its time, and this just feels like a. Do you know? I'll pass it on to you in a second. But the thing that reminds me of this, again, this sounds terrible. This feels TV to me. It feels like a TV movie. Does it not you? And I think that is like
100%.
yeah, and I think that is probably issues with a budget. It feels like a first win screenplay that they found somewhere. I don't know if this is. I don't think this is based on anything, is it? I don't think it's based on a book or.
I don't think so. Oh no, it is.
Oh, is it really?
I think so. One second.
Well, yeah, the adaptation is dire. Maybe this is perhaps bar where we should do a research team.
Yeah, it is. It's based on Once Off Guard, a 1942, I believe, novel. Yeah, novel by J.H. Wallace.
Have you seen the reviews for this on Letterboxd?
No, I've not.
It's incredibly popular.
Yeah.
3.7 average.
Damn.
Hillary, 3.5
I think it got
stars.
Nominated for an Oscar. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it did. Weird. I don't get, as you mentioned, I was thinking about this and I was like, this is perfect. Like, this is exactly what you'd expect if you like just found a free movie on YouTube where you're like, it's not, and ironically, it is available for free on YouTube, FYI. Where you just like, it's there, but it's definitely like you didn't rent it, you didn't pay money for it, it was just free on YouTube. And as you mentioned, I really like the surprise party like analogy. It's like if you went to a surprise party and like the lights came on and it wasn't your friends, it was like a bunch of strangers and they got you like a rock from your garden as like a present, and you're like, okay, like I guess this is weird. I don't like this, but I guess it was technically a surprise. It's really an odd one. You know, sorry, Fritz Lang. Hate to do this to you in your episode. This one was rough. I'll admit it. um, did not age particularly well. Maybe we can move on though, because let's see. This is okay. One strike down. Let's see if we can hit it out of the park for the next one. Jumping to 1947, Secret Beyond the Door. Jack, I will turn it over to you first for this one. What were your thoughts on Secret Beyond the Door?
Oh. If the woman in the window is flat and timid, I think this is tenfold. I feel like this is a narrative that is far more interesting than the feature that we spoke about. I think this has a very much more integral production design. It has a narration where we follow this female character. I think there's a really interesting thematic and narrative around here, but it's so darn slow. It's so inconsequential of actually wanting to go there a little bit and take on a little bit of fright, a little bit of tension. The atmosphere, the narrative twist comes way too long. It then goes to a place in its third act where it just tells the viewer everything, and there is literally no atmosphere. There's no tension. It is verbal resolve once again in this feature, and the thematic undertones within its final act are iffy to say the least. It's an interesting feature about tragedy. It's an interesting feature about trauma. It's lacking on substance in both those regards on those topics. I think the production design is somewhat weak in a Fritz Lang feature. I think the only time where I sort of liked it was in the Gothic Gardens when she tries to do her escape. I'm like, God, we're back with the Wolfman. I love it. I love that. I loved it in the Nun, the 2018 Nun. I was like, shit, like they've got me. And then the rest of the feature happened. I was like, this is not very good. But I like those Gothic elements to it. It felt like Fritz Lang's Rebecca on a multitude of reasons, primarily narratively, primarily plot device. I thought it was good. It was never compelling to me. Both of them were never compelling. I think of how the narrative unfolds in The Woman in the Window was far more interesting to me than this. Partly because I think narratively this is like a very strangely edited feature where we have a character just going back and forth into places that don't have any texture. She's getting married, then she's in somewhere in an office, then she's in Mexico, then she's here, then she's in a hotel room, then she goes back to this mansion, and she leaves, then she goes back here. In the end, she leaves, she goes back here, and I think that there is such a severe lack of momentum. I'll say there are rewards to both of them, and I think that this feature is again it's good, but God, not to repeat myself, but I just found myself never to be compelled here. I never thought. I think the central character is interesting. I never find anything compelling here. I think perhaps it fails with a really charismatic male lead here. I don't think he's charismatic enough to enrapture this woman, as we don't really know them. I don't think he's physically or visually stimulating for that type of character to um, intertwine this character, this lead actress that we find, this lead character. And I think when it gets to the big bits towards the third act, especially its middle act, and there's no level of suspense because I don't think there's a physicality of the performance. There's not this external. It's all just like very much again. I hate the word to keep on using that word, but very much mundane. We're just going through the process, and granted that's a product of its era. But I think when you can find these compelling actors and actresses like you know Joan Crawford and stuff like that, Greta Garbo at these times, Betty Davis, these phenomenal actresses, and people who can really push that external weight of anger and anguish and torment, and also like the actress in Sunset Boulevard, who is like sensational as a silent star, being able to resolve, have it all external, and then when she speaks, it's like you've got it already. I just think there's a lack of that. I think there's a lack of prowess here. Two very much middle ground Fritz Lang features. I'll throw it to you, but I don't know if I can't remember which two reviews I saw, but one of them has got a bad review, one of them's got a good review. So I'm waiting to see which one is which. But I feel like I know where this is going. But I'm intrigued where you're going to go with this.
I'll be honest. So I'm definitely. We'll get to the flaws. I am definitely more positive on this one than you are.
Okay.
Maybe it's because I'm putting it into comparison with the woman in the window that did nothing for me. But this, I think, has all like the basic, even just starts of what I'm looking for out of a Fritz Lang feature compared to that film. There are interesting choices with filmmaking, with lighting, with style. The plot here, the narrative, there are little breadcrumbs that ultimately build to a reveal and you can engage with it. The ideas are really interesting on paper and sound really kind of fucked up at times, and it's interesting, it's engaging. I think there's two big areas where this film starts to struggle. The first is production design. I agree. Outside of going outside, this film not just lacks a texture, but so much of this house and these scenes where the guy creates scenes of murder that needs to hold an impact and hold a weight and hold a venom. The production design fails it. It's just a normal room with like a handkerchief out, and it's like, okay, that sucks. Boring. The other one is in its ability with showing versus telling. In a lot of ways, it's funny you mentioned the Wolfman. This reminds me in the lead character, like the Wolfman, where it's a character who implicitly, inherently has something about him that he hates and is haunting him that leads to the destruction of others. Michael Redgrave is no Lon Chaney Jr. He cannot show this inner conflict. He cannot show this inner hauntingness within him. He cannot show these little moments of regret. So the film literally, as you mentioned, has to have a sequence at the end that it just says it. It basically replays the film and just says like, hey, this is actually what I was feeling the entire time. And I think that's the big area where I think Redgrave is not great here. But outside of those elements, I found myself engaged by this, definitely slow at times, but I was definitely engaged with all the little pieces, seeing where it was going to build to. I think Joan Bennett, again, is fantastic here. I will say, engaging with this film under a modern lens, for sure, the moral here, it's definitely not great, right? We're not going to lie. But ultimately is a look at like the testament of love and the impact of love, even though I think it is not particularly woke or particularly correct. There was enough here that I was at least engaged, and I felt like I was satisfied enough with some of the tension towards the end. But again, there are some issues with storytelling. But again, the visuals are good. I think Fritz Lang behind the camera here, there are moments that really pop out to me. There's one where she like wakes up and the light flashes on her. That's great. This is definitely in every way, even if it's not top tier Fritz Lang, what I would expect from this director, it is ultimately something compared to what The Woman in the Window was, which was nothing. And for that, it stands out much more for me. I wouldn't rewatch this per se, but I definitely enjoyed this for what it was.
Yeah, the 1940s weren't particularly a great time for Fritz Lang, again, like for a multitude of reasons. But I think his output, bar, I think it's 1936 or 1938, I think until at least the early 50s, I think he loses about 10 years there. I think partly it's due to do with the rise of Nazism. I think on a personal level, from being a German native, I think that takes its toll, because you're in a foreign country which is bombing the people that are essentially where you're from. And I think there's moral ambiguity there as well, in the fact that they're fighting the correct fight, but also there's innocent people dying there who he will probably know. A creative team there that he knows that he's probably changed, not sides or anything like that, but he's gone to a different country and been and taken his chance, and he's been rewarded with a great career while the people contemporaries around him are probably being slaughtered for a multitude of reasons in Nazi Germany. But I also think that because of the war as well, there's a restrictive in budget and there's a restrictive in features. Because Edward G. Robinson after this goes on to do a myriad of just Cold War features. He did one with Orson Welles called The Stranger, which is quite good as well. But he goes on this. Usually plays like an FBI agent who goes to find Nazi war criminals, and then the 50s Cold War and stuff like that, so on and so forth. And I think that's the age that he comes into as well. But I think Fritz Lang's not particularly fond of that bar ministry if he was. But the 40s were not very kind to him. It's the 50s where you get into the second wind of like the Billy Wilders, Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and he has the Big Heat, which is the big one, Bar Metropolis. For Bar is German expressionism, his silent features. That's the big one in the American crowd where it's like, oh shit, like this Fritz Lang character is not someone to be put out. I do think Joan Bennett's quite good here. I think there's an interesting parallel between The Woman in the Window. Which one did you watch first? Did you watch Woman in the Window first, then this?
I watched this first. But then
really? Right.
Yeah.
I watched The Woman in the Window first. Interesting. And we both come out on opposing views on this. Interesting. That might have something to do with it. But seeing Joan Bennett in the 1944, being sort of reduced to a quivering femme fatale who is maybe up to something, but then it really sort of reveals itself that she's not. She's just quite an innocent party in this who's, fucked up in more words than one. And then to see essentially 3 years later in this, the evolution as the actress. I think visually, I think she looks. Again, but she's extremely pretty in both films. She looks very different here. I think she takes more on of a character. She takes more on a performance. I think she's interesting. I appreciate the narration, because it's a noir staple, but it very much does take the sting out of just watching a performance evolve. It happened to Bogart all the time. You have this wonderful face, this wonderful delivery of dialogue, and it's reduced to fucking off-screen narration. Which really annoys me in the Maltese Falcon. Fucking Casablanca is a perfect example of like why it looks really good. But again, back to the point. I think she's quite good here. I think she gets the characterization. I think she's great at the external at times. I just don't think she has much to bounce off. I don't think she has. I think the material's there, but she has to work off this relationship of, is it crazy? Or is he crazy? Is she crazy? And I think she does a really good job of it. I just don't think her companions or contemporaries around her are particularly intertwined in that dynamic and don't want to feed her into it. That's just part of the time.
When so much of it is her alone.
Yeah.
I mean, she spends the vast majority of this film in this giant house, just completely alone, running around it, trying to play off various props and settings. It's very rare that she actually has a scene. I mean, she has a few of like housekeepers and such, but especially with Michael Redgrave, she really does not have that many. I mean, kind of that is a narrative purpose also. But she really only has a handful of scenes even with him. Which is not helpful to that cause.
Yeah, because I think narratively you don't get, again, that's why the lack of Michael Redgrave. I think you need a power star there. I think you need someone with a face, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just think that you need someone that, like, you want to question her sanity when your heart and your head look at people. And I think that's what Hitchcock did a really good job of. And I think Bogart was one where you look at Bogart and you think you look like you aren't the person you say you are, and then you watch it and it's like, oh wow, like he's not this bad guy. I think Cagney was brilliant at it. I think that these faces, I just think Redgrave gives this an angle of like he's very much acute. He's like, oh yeah, I've had some trauma, and I apologize for my actions, and you sort of like, oh yeah, yeah. There's not sort of this insipid nature to it. It's like where you look at Cheney, and I know we're going back 10 years beforehand, but when you watch like a film like this, or even Karloff, for example, or just early Hitchcock stuff where you have that sly smile, like Charles Lawton's one where you're watching someone and you think like, fucking hell, like that man looks very innocent, but also there's something undertones there, and I think Cagney's also a brilliant detector of that again, but Bogart. But here, I just think it lacks that male suitor where you have to question I think I don't know if you've seen the Ben Wheatley remake of Rebecca. I reviewed it for the site. I thought it was terrible.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I really like Ben Wheatley, but I thought that was terrible. That's an interesting casting point with Arnie Hammer there, because Arnie Hammer doesn't. He's like the Redgrave thing where you're watching someone and like you don't have that second wind to have to be able to talk to someone in a tone where he diffuses it. I think he's just monotone, monotone, monotone. I think that this is a performance that when he talks to Joan Burnett, you want him to de-escalate everything in a sense of this. It's hard to describe, but again, I just used the de-escalate to bring it back down to earth, so that when it happens again, when she sort of sees these things, or she starts to think something's not right here, we as an audience have to question her. I think that makes the substance of the feature quite interesting when you get to Hitchcock, um, especially when you get to Psycho and stuff. I think that with Janet Leigh, that's what he's great as. I just don't think you get that here. I don't think you have the narrative, the screenplay, the vibe working in tangent with the audience. I think it just is a singular, which is a very much like academic way of saying something like it's just nothingness. And I hope that's a good description to compare it to. It's like, well, I think when you have a narrative, you want it to play with the viewer because you want to guess. You want to guess when you're watching Sunset Boulevard what is going on here. Double Indemnity is perfect for it. It's like, hang on a second. I tell you, the best example of it is the Nicholas Ray Bogart feature, in a lonely place. Have you ever seen it? Oh, that is a feature that has two characters in a house, right? And something's not quite right, and the writer plays with you as much as it does with the characters. It's a perfect concoction, and I'd love you for you to watch it. It's a Criterion as well. It's brilliant transfer, it's gorgeous. Bogart's amazing in it. Nicholas Ray as well behind the camera, it's exquisite. But when you compare it to something like this, I don't think this takes that second wind. Because you do have a dynamic with his sister and with his landlady, and there's something to do with that. But it's all about third-party backstory that gets us in the end. And to me, I'm watching something to be thrilled about what we're seeing on screen, and I just don't think this fulfills the conviction that I think it wants to. But again, I am surprised that you find this more enthralling. What is it? Are you talking about visually here? Are you cinematically? Do you think
I think just
thematically?
I think in every way. I think again, especially compared to The Woman in the Window, this is way better filmmaking. This is way more interesting filmmaking. Narratively, this is way more engaging. There are breadcrumbs here. There's not always a great follow through. I will say there is some people in the house, like there's one woman who has a scar, and then minor spoilers, you learn she doesn't have a scar, and like there's something like that where you kind of expect everything to tie in, and it doesn't really fully get there. I also think the third act climax is a bit underwhelming with some certain
Anticlimactic,
elements of how that
yeah.
builds, but I still think the ideas here are definitely more substantial and more engaged me much more. I'm curious, have you seen Scarlet Street from 1945?
No, because I know that that's Edward G. Robinson, Joan Burnett, and Fritz Lang again. I
Right.
haven't seen that, but it is on my Noir November list.
Okay. I'm curious about that because that feels like we talked about the evolution between The Woman in the Window and this. That feels like a missing piece on that evolution chart that we're kind of crafting.
Right.
But I definitely like, again, I would not necessarily say go home and, if you're listening at home, run and watch this. It's the best film you're ever going to see. But it certainly is like, I don't know, for a lighter noir watch, I think this delivered. But it's still even like, it, on the scale of what I expect from someone like Fritz Lang, this is still extremely disappointing, I will say. I'll throw it over to you, the kind of question you asked me earlier. So, like, how do you view Fritz Lang, especially some of that earlier work, and translating to his later career pathway? How do you view Fritz Lang?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at his, again, you go through the expressionism. So you go at like Dr. Mabuse and stuff like that. I probably butchered that name. But you get to Metropolis and you look at a creative director going through essentially after World War One, a country revamping itself, but slowly but surely, fascism is taking over for the history buffs out there. It's slowly consuming the workforce, and it doesn't really have an enemy just yet, but it has like a name, but it's slowly consuming itself. I think when you look at Germany being rebuilt or being promised to be rebuilt from the ashes. I think you get visionaries like Metropolis, where you think like the possibilities of endless when in the aims of like we can become gods, but we can build upwards, we can build out, we can build upwards, and we can take that next step. And I think that when you look at Fritz Lang, I think he's one of the the creatives in Germany at that time who look at that, not necessarily promise, but ideology, and uses that in German expression. He goes from the dark horror and then turns into that, and then what happens is Nazism rises, and I think he leaves Germany, goes to America, and then I think he gets caught up with these ideas, and I think a lot of Hong Kong directors struggled to do it in the 90s, and that's also due to not necessarily racial issues, but I also think it's to do with not ethical reasons, but also I think like social political reasons, the likes of Hong Kong being British territory, then being given back in the 90s to China, but Hong Kong still being like a British centrist state, which I think, and they have the issues now when you have the action features coming out from that. I think is interesting. But Fritz Lang came out of Germany, and primarily worked in sort of in the late 30s in dramas, American centric dramas. So you have Fury about a man who is supposedly murdered someone, and they try to lynch him, and it's a white man. I think it's Henry Fonda, if I'm not mistaken. And that's 36. So you've 3 years off World War II there, but you're talking about social dynamics of a German coming over and sort of getting it in America. And then it's the one that you said you only live once is there as well. There is another one that I forget. And then the 40s happen, the war breaks out. I think his dynamic changes to like covering just purely noir features. A, because they sell, and B, because I think that people, I just think it's like the superhero time of its, the genre of its time, where you can get bums on seats, because I think it's an aspect of like getting away from the war as well. And I think you can bring in references to that, which slowly becomes in the war effort when they figure that out. But I also think it's like a generational thing where you can just leave that. You don't have to think about where your dad is. I don't think you have to think about where your mom's going to get food for tonight. I think it's one of those things where you can go to the cinema. I think he just gets entangled with that. But then the 50s turn. I know this is like a history lesson, but the 50s come out, and the gangster era has gone. The noir era sort of like gone from like very mainstream. You get into like the femme fatales, then you get into your Sunset Boulevards. And I think he has a second wind. I just think also that the film, I think the film industry has a boom, doesn't it? You have all these people coming back over, trying to find a way to not even forget, but try to find stability. And I think cinema is that place where people just went to see new stories, and I think his boom comes in. Like the Big Heat is a masterpiece. I haven't seen it. I've read enough about them, but you have a few features there. You have a few Amazonian features. You have a one with I think Marilyn Monroe is in one of them, and then you have like While the City Sleeps. You have these interesting little features again. Like he has this second wind of noir, probably allocate the budget, but most importantly, I think in the 50s you have a revamp of the. I'm so sorry this is going on. Apologies, but the history lesson. But I think in the 50s in cinema history, you have the revamp of what an actor is. You have your James Deans, you have your Dennis Hoppers, you have your Brandos, you have your Paul Newmans. I think people came back from the war, had children, and cinema boomed, and people wanted to become actors. I think the one thing that was popular with Fritz Lang is that I think people saw his early work and then was like, "Oh, Fritz Lang is like he's actually a really good director." I think people were just galvanized towards that, but also the workforce was there. There were stronger actors. There were people who wanted to read. There was method. That if you wanted to play a German scientist or a German officer or just a gangster, you wore those clothes. You put on that accent. You didn't just put an eyeglass on and spoke with a British accent as a Nazi officer. I think that finally in the 50s, the trade caught up with his vision. It was just a shame that I think he wasn't 20, 30 years younger. But the 50s are particularly very good for him as well. I think if anyone out there, you should watch the 50s. But I think then Wilder just comes on and was like, yeah, no, Ace in the Hole, Witness the Prosecution, Sunset Boulevard, Double Indemnity. You just have an American director as well. This is important. An American director, although I think his heritage is not particularly American, if I'm not so wrong. But your Cagneys then disappear. Your Bogarts are now dead. Your Deans are on the rise. Your Paul Newmans, your Marlon Brando on the waterfront, so on and so forth. And the '60s turn up and things change. The American dramas come back. The Steinbecks, stuff that he was doing in the '30s. So it's an interesting one. I think he was there for a time and galvanized his opportunities. I think he was probably too early on two fronts. The German expression, I think he's partly there, an inventor there as well. But I also think in his American work, I think he was probably just. I think the world around him wasn't quite ready, and then when it was, I think it changed. I would, I would love to have seen Fritz Lang in the '70s. I would love to have seen him with like the Milos Forman era or the Paul Schrader era, and the Scorsese era at the same age. I think Fritz Lang, and looking at modern America or even in Germany at that time, coming back with his vision, like the shit he was doing in 1927 with Metropolis. You've got a director now, Francis Ford Coppola, ultimately homaging in 2024, and it's crazy how much Fritz Lang got away with that. Although with more creatives, I must admit.
Well, it's interesting. There's very few film directors, and sorry, everyone, we're going to stay in the history lesson for a little bit longer, where like you can directly see the influence or the relationship rather between a creative and the society he belongs to at any certain moment. Because when he's making Metropolis, when he's making those German films, he's in the middle of the Weimar Republic, which is like out of World War One. There's this newfound freedom. There is this boom of creativity and these big ideas and this celebration because finally these can be expressed in the mainstream. Then you get the dissolution of Germany and the destruction of Germany, largely due to the Treaty of Versailles, and then it leads into World War II. He comes over here. Like it's very fascinating seeing how the relationship is between society and filmmaker. Where you watch his German films, that's very, very Weimar Republic. You watch his 1940s Americans films, those are very, very much American 1940s. To where I think in a lot of ways we lack examples of creatives that go through such drastic changes and where they actually exist and what's on their mind around them. Also, just imagine coming from the Weimar Republic and then seeing the rise of fascism, as you mentioned, like all that weighing on your head and on your soul and on your mind is an incredibly rich personal history to look at that is then ultimately reflected in the filmography. That makes it like a really interesting and underrated, I think, director when people like as far as talking about engaging narratives through filmographies. Now that his films are always great. I mean, we kind of have a pretty mid conversation today, but there's a lot there to dissect and break down that I feel like a lot of people are quite ignorant to, even though I think Fritz Lang in general is very respected, and especially those German films are still held on quite a high pedestal. There's a lot that those say about history and about culture and about society in these very like certain circumstances that is worth sponging out.
Yeah, I'll end on a positive on my front. I think that when you look at Fritz Lang as a director, and again, this is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, but I mean this with like the greatest respect. He came in the '30s when Capra was there. He came in the '40s when Raoul Walsh and Michael Kulditz were making, gangster features or at least even just noir features. And then in the '50s, when you've got like the John Ford and stuff, or in the John Waynes, or just that '50s era, he was there as well. And then he was there just at the tip of the '60s. And I think that in each decade from like the tens, the 20s, the 30s, for 50 years, I think within those 10 years in each decade, I think you'll probably find there'll be two masterpieces in there. And I think for a director who was essentially a German through and through to go over to America and to revitalize his career, and I think he played within the with the cornerstone of the American market. Don't get me wrong, but when you put him in the era of Frank Capra or Billy Wilder and John Wayne and so on and so forth, I still think he holds his own, and I think that's an incredible testament to his character, but also as his cinematic prowess. It did not matter what decade he was in. It did not matter what era he was in. I think he could pull a feature and he could make it sort of visually interesting or engaging. And still with these two, there's bits in them where I'm like, oh wow, like these are not poor features. I think within his filmography, they're poorish. They're both like good. They're just not great. But when you compare something like this to The Big Heat, or again Ministry of Fear, or even Fury, which I didn't love, but the representation of that is like wow. And then you've got like this features you've seen M. Like what? I'm like that's 51. So it's interesting going back and forth, back and forth. But I think he holds his own in a lot of it. I think he's a very much um, misrepresented. I would say, because I think like you, I think when you go to this is ridiculous, but I think when you bring his name up in film circles, I think you've got the Metropolis, and then you've got the German horror stuff, and I think a lot of people forget that he had a career in the 30s and 40s and 50s in America. And I think a lot of people don't sort of look at that in a time of him booming. I think you could probably find his lineage of cinematic prowess through a lot of filmmakers in the 60s and 70s, especially like a Michael Mann, shit like that, like God, that's so influential here. But again, I'm glad that you've done this. I'm glad you've done the program, because I know that we did the James Whale stuff and the Old Dark House and especially the Universal Monsters. I think this is a really interesting educational thing, because I would have seen these, but I would have watched them in a weekend where I'm like, oh, okay. I wouldn't have had to have this conversation with Fritz Lang. So I appreciate you choosing this as a program. I think they've been really two interesting features. They just happen to be two middle ground Fritz Lang. But for anyone out there, I think most of his work is probably ready available on YouTube. And there's gonna a lot. I know he's got a lot of stuff on the Criterion, and I know there's a few bits and pieces on Indicator, so on and so forth. But for watching a 1930s director, a 50s, 40s director play with the camera, check out Fritz Lang, check out Orson Welles. Like the stuff they were doing then, comparative to now, is frightening. There's very much like a step back in the 60s. Very much just like people just did not want to evolve with the camera. Whereas these two, God, like Fritz Lang in Metropolis, like in-house editing, aesthetic, production design, whew, really crazy stuff. So yeah, big up Edward G. Robinson and that cameo he had in the Batman.
For sure. Well, I think that does it for our conversation on Fritz Lang and these two films. As Jack mentions, very widely available on YouTube, as well as a lot of Fritz Lang stuff. Again, I would echo that statement, even if these two aren't necessarily two of the strongest features. Undeniably a worthy filmography, and I'm happy that we continue to add to our little like patchwork quilt of just different filmmakers from different eras, from different areas in the world, building this quilt of what cinema is, because I think it just gets richer as it gets bigger and bigger. So Fritz Lang, I'm happy that you have a spot on our quilt. With that, let's go to our question of the week, because this is celebrating Noir November, and I'm asking, what is your favorite film noir feature? What is your favorite example of this genre? Quite a big question, but Jack, I know you are very big on this. You do Noir November every single year. So is there one or two that stand out to you?
Right. This question is actually really cruel, because you do this every week. Every week, like, you give really difficult ones. And last year, I saw some really big ones, like Hitchcock. I had like this massive thing with Bogart and stuff. I'm sorry to do this. I'm gonna have to name a few, and then I'm gonna have to give my answer. But I'll name a few that people haven't really seen. Um, Orson Welles, Edward G. Robinson in The Stranger, where someone may or may not be a Nazi collaborator. It's 95 minutes, 1946. Phenomenal stuff. Orson Welles directed as well. Lady in Shanghai, another Orson Welles, 87 minutes. You should read of what he tried to do in the final act of that feature with mirrors, but the budget constraints at the time wouldn't let him to do it. Fabulous. There's a lot of gangsters here. They probably shouldn't have had that. Charles Lawton in The Suspect, Robert Sidomak, I think it is, or Sidomak, which is another really good noir director who does not get the credit he deserves. He's a store owner in England. This was going to be my top tip, but this is so good, Carson. And he has a relationship with someone, and then his wife is there, and the noir stuff is it's so good that the ending sequence is phenomenal, where it's just so good, and no one's seen it. Fury's good. Um, the 2 seconds is the Woody Robinson thing about that's really good. In a Lonely Place. If I come back next week and you and November have not seen that, I will cause an absolute. I will cause utter mayhem. Laura is good. That's Otto Preminger as well, another great German director who came over. Ministry of Fear. The one I'm going to choose, however, is one that I've got to get it right, because sometimes I get this wrong. Right, this is it. I think this is the one, but I get it mixed up a little bit, and it would be Dark Passage with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. I had never seen this, and this is what I mean about filmmakers. Just no one getting it. I think this is it. Humphrey Bogart is a character, right, who allegedly kills his wife, and he escapes prison in the opening 20 minutes, right? This is a feature the same year as A Secret Beyond the Door. The same year, the first act is shot completely in POV, and he has a face change in it, so you never get to see his original face. It's just his voice. And Lauren Bacall talks to the camera as if it's him, and we follow him going places. He's in a car, and he speaks to her. The camera moves. It's like 1947. I know it's probably been done before. And it's genius. You just have this voice. You know it's Bogart, but you don't have anything else. And of how ingenious it all is. And then you get this twist toward the end where something's not quite right and stuff like that. Oh my god, it was so good. Delmer Daves is the director, and I don't think I've seen much of Delmer Daves. He did 3:10 to Yuma and the original Broken Arrow, so very much a Western director. Fabulous. That would be my favourite noir feature, just because I could not believe how good that was. But this needs to be good now because I've given about 9 options. So please.
No, I love it. I'm not as deep into the noir world as you are, so I'm not going to pick something so inspired. I'm going Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. I don't know if you've seen this film.
I haven't.
Okay. Great film. I won't spoil it for you, but you want to talk about like visual intensity. You want to talk about twists and turns. You want to talk about drawing out that suspension, that tension. This film is utterly fantastic. I mean, it's Orson Welles, probably one of the strongest filmmakers of all time. One we probably need to talk about here on the podcast eventually. But Touch of Evil is a really fantastic film that I would highly recommend. 1958 for everyone at home. So with that, I hope everyone has a good Noir November. Let's get to our rapid reviews. Anything we've seen recently that we haven't talked about on the podcast. Jack, I'm sure you have a nice list. We've been off for 2 weeks, so I can't wait to hear what you watched.
I just want to apologize for what you're going to hear before this, and I'm going to blame you because this is your fault you've done this. I'm going to try to do this so quick, it's unbelievable. And I think I know where I am. I think we did The Mummy, didn't we? So and I talked about Smile. I watched the first 4 Hellraiser features. I watched the first one in 35mm, and it scared the shit out of me. I watched Hellbound, which, because you said you quite liked it, if I don't remember rightly. Or were you middle ground on it?
I was thumbs up. I was like, there.
I think it takes some risks. I didn't think it was good as the first one, but I thought it was okay. The third one was good. Okay. I really enjoyed the fourth one, but I know there's a work print of the third and fourth one. I'm going to try and watch that before Halloween ends. I watched the remake of Hellraiser. Yeah, interesting. I love the trans representation. I love the androgynous aspect of it all. Sensei fan there, so I loved the fact that we got to see a trans performer on the screen. I think she's like phenomenal in that as well. I think she's like so like uncomfortable, unnerving, and the voice change they do as well. I was like, oh my god, like because obviously I've heard how she speaks as well. And I'm like, I was wondering if they were going to go for like a tenderness to it, but they do the same thing they do with Pinhead, with I can't remember his name, Bradley. Can't remember his name. That's bad, isn't it? But yeah, fabulous because it just like runs through. It's brilliant. And I went on a Clive Barker binge. I watched Lords of Illusion. God, that's bad. That's John Carpenter levels of just like, oh my god, what we're doing here. And I watched. I don't know if you've seen this. I watched Nightbreed, which is infamous for having three different versions. It has a theatrical cut that's horrific. David Cronenberg plays Slender Man serial killer in this. Yes, trust me, with like arsehole face makeup, where he wears a mask with buttons as eyes, and like a drawn out pin. Yeah, there's a director's cut that got found in 2014, but there's also something called the cable cut, which is 198 minutes long. So obviously, I watched the cable cut and I thought it was absolutely horrific. Could not get through it. I did finish it, but it was terrible. I had date night with my wife, and we watched the director's cut of Scream, the Laserdisc cut, which is gory to say the least. There's like 30 seconds of it, and I know it's like proper nerdy, but it does recontextualize a lot of stuff. It's gutting in it. Did go watch Terrifier 3. Liked it. Oh my god, does anamorphic lenses change the whole viewing of an experience? The man finally figured out what a fucking lens is and lighting, and it's so good. It deserves getting 60 million when the other horror stuff's out, which I'm going to talk about. It was very very chilling. The first 10-15 minutes of that feature, I could have walked. It was that grim. It was like Saw X level of like, do I want to put myself through this? And I was like, but it was very very good. I watched the 1979 Salem's Lot. Um, so boring. It was unbelievable. So boring. I watched the 3 hour cut of it. It was boring. I watched the remake. I quite enjoyed it. I think the Pullman son is definitely going to be the next Tom Cruise. I really do think he's got like there's something about him there. I think he's really quite good. I noticed you watched this recently, and this is not planned, but I also watched The Faculty, and I was like, oh, this is good. This is good. Strange things are going on here, but this is good. We're going to get a lot worse here, so bear with me. I watched the third I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer, which has got the worst colour grade. It looks like it's shot in black and white. Horrific. And for Halloween, I watched a 35mm scan of Halloween 4, which I'm going to do a deeper review thoughts on Letterboxd for it because I've got a lot to say about that feature. But the 35mm scan looked amazing on it. I watched the work print of Rob Zombie's Halloween, which I thought was very interesting because it's nothing to do with Laura, it's all to do with Michael, which we should have done for our Halloween 1 and 2 thing on Gems, but we don't want to go back to that. For shits and giggles, I watched the 1912 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde just to see the camera work in it. I thought it was quite good. It's free on YouTube. It's only about 10 minutes long, but I thought it was fun. I watched Wes Craven's Cursed. I watched the theatrical cut. If anyone's out there, watch the uncut version. There's allegedly a work print out there I'm desperately wanting to watch because Rick Baker, which is interesting with Wolfman conversation you had. Anyone go out there, listen to the October bonus episode, it's fabulous. But Wes Craven, they did practical effects and then they reshot all the entire feature with CGI. Very strange. And then coming up very closely, I watched Island of Lost Souls, the Dr. Moreau thing. That is absolutely horrifying for its time. That was banned for like 20 years, and so it should have been. How that is utterly frightening makeup. 71 minutes of just like, this is beginning to creep me out here. And I'm 3/4 of the way through it, so I'll mention it. I'm watching John Carpenter. Someone's watching me. I've got a few more Halloween stuff to watch. I've got about 20 more features to watch. Well, not 20. I've got about 5, 7, maybe 8 more features to watch of Halloween, and then I'm done. And then my Noir November starts, so I'm really excited. These 2 last months have been really good for me for watching movies. I fucking loved it. I've done my exorcism feature as well. I planned to do it this last weekend, so I'm glad I've done that. But yeah, that's I've seen a lot, but it has been the 2 weeks. Okay, it has been the 2 weeks. I'm sorry. Now, shock me here because I'm expecting to hear some good stuff. I'm expecting to hear your Halloween stuff as well. What did you watch the 31st? You better have watched something.
I definitely watched something.
Did
I actually? Don't think I did. Genuinely.
Well,
Let's start. with since last time we spoke. I went to AFI Fest, the film festival in Los Angeles. So I'm going to just talk about not everything I saw, but the highlights. I saw David Cronenberg's The Shrouds. Ooh, fascinating film. It feels like Cronenberg is back. I was not a big fan of his last one. A lot here to dissect about grief, about technology. I see why some people would get really hostile when it starts going deep into a conspiracy theory within it, where it's like it presents a mystery and it's like people are possibly lying about certain things. Like, it's very deep and it's very dense and it's all very emotionally there. I don't want to spoil anything. I don't want to give anything away. And it ends in one of like the most, like, you have no idea you're in the final scene, and then it just cuts to the credits and everyone was like, what the fuck? But I liked it. I really liked it, but it's one I need to like watch again. I would need to, before, if I did a podcast or anything on it, like watch it one or two more times, because you get the sense in the first viewing, obviously, of like, okay, what is happening? What is this world? What are these characters? And then you kind of need to see it again to kind of parse what is real, who is lying, and all that.
How was the reception?
Almodovar, good. At my theater, was really good. Everyone really liked it. I think universally everyone pretty much likes it, outside of one critic who didn't like it at Cannes. But the rest, I think, have liked it. So it's definitely good. Almodovar's The Room Next Door. And again, I wasn't a big fan of his last one, so I was a little like, what are we doing? His English language debut, really, really like the film. I think Tilda Swinton gives one of the best performances of the year here, about two old friends who reconnect. One of them is dying of cancer and says, hey, I would love if you would come out to this beautiful mansion in the woods I'm going to rent and just be there. Well, one day I'm going to take this pill and kill myself so I don't go through the struggles of dying of cancer. And I'm not going to tell you when. It's not going to be like you're in the room. It's just, you're in the house. I want someone there who will find my body and
feel good comedy then, yeah.
Super feel good. Yeah. I love how this blends Almodovar's style with the English language format. It's like it plays very it's very Almodovar. It doesn't lose the Almodovar feel in a way I love, with the color and such. Really emotional, quite funny. Actually, there is a lot of personality here to where it's very entertaining to watch. I know Nick just watched this also and really liked it. So as someone who is, you can go back and listen to our Bad Education review, someone who is not always the biggest Almodovar fan, I thought this was one of his stronger efforts. Jack, I got to see the new Schrader film. I got to meet my boy, number
Did
one.
You
I got to
really?
meet Shake. I shook his hand.
Oh, wow.
I got to watch O Canada. Definitely, I would not put this in the same level I've put his other recent works. I think that trilogy is really strong that he put out with First Reformed, Card Counter, and Master Gardener. But this is still up there. A really interesting look at the mythos we put out about ourselves, the mythology we build, what is true, what isn't true, about this guy who is telling his story. He's a leftist documentarian from Canada. He's telling his story, and his wife is like, what are you talking about? None of this happened. And he's like, yes, it did. I just didn't tell you. And you go through and you don't know what's real or what's not. And it's breaking down his lore he's built about his life. Super interesting film. I love Schrader, and this was a great movie. And then right from that, I went to Viet and Nam, a film about two gay Vietnamese coal miners in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
I really want to write about this film, but it's like kind of complex, because half of this is obviously like queerness and getting into what does it mean to be queer and queer connection, and I can relate to all that. And then half of this is like very, very based in the cultural like specificness of Vietnam, and the identity of their culture. Also, this takes place in like 2001, so we are like starting to get a few decades after the Vietnam War, but there's a lot about that and how that shaped the country. The more I think about this film, the more I love it and the more I read about it. But it's one where I just like, I definitely am not the best voice to dissect it. But I do want to talk about it eventually. But it is a really good film, a little bit slow at times, but I would recommend it. Some of the most beautiful cinematography of the year. No Other Land, a pretty like brutal documentary about in 2020 the Palestine crisis and how Israel just takes bulldozers and plows down buildings with no warning, and plows down homes and schools and communities and leaves them with nothing, and leaves them just bloody and hurt and dying, with absolutely no care for the humanity. 90 minutes of just like pure evil on screen, which is not fun, but definitely is something that needs to be seen. A really, really powerful film. And then the kind of the shock of the festival, Nick saw this at Berlin and I think liked it, but was kind of mixed on it, was My Favorite Cake, an Iranian film about a 70-year-old woman who decides after the death of her husband to reclaim her femininity and go out there and try to date again under Iran's current Islamic law, which is very restrictive. Women have to wear hijabs. You can't really wear makeup. I thought this was a really touching and beautiful film in just the vacuum of what the film is. But then you look at the filmmakers behind this who literally got their passports revoked for making the film, who got threatened with jail time. In global cinema right now, Iranian filmmakers are under attack. It's like actually quite like vile when you look at it and how much violence there is towards filmmakers trying to portray anything but a very simple narrative. And I thought this, like, in that context, also just blossomed. I think this is one of the best films of the year and one I really enjoyed. And then let's see, I didn't watch anything on Halloween. I went to a Halloween party. Actually, I had like literally the most insane Halloween of my life. I had a fire evacuation notice for my house. I had not one but two armed shootings like right here. So
What?
it was crazy. I didn't watch any films. I had an active shooter situation with helicopters above my house saying to stay inside because we're on lockdown because there was literally an active
Oh
shooter.
my god!
It was a mess. Halloween in America. And then I went to a party. It was a whole thing. But I didn't watch any films actually that day. But I did watch Hellraiser 2 and 3. I thought 2 was good. 3 was fine. Oh, I watched on Netflix It's What's Inside. That's their like horror movie this season. It was quite interesting. Definitely messy. It's definitely one of those that has a great concept and doesn't fully know how to execute it. But it's about a group of friends. They have this machine to where they can switch souls of who's in what body. Things go wrong, obviously. There's some twists and turns. For like a Halloween, I got this. I watched this with Paul just like one night, and it was like, yeah, for when you're with friends, it's a really fun watch. Probably don't need to seek this out if you missed it, to be honest. And then I guess I'll finish off Venom: The Last Dance.
Oh god!
As the leading critic who supports Morbius, according to Rotten Tomatoes. That was the first one they listed. As someone who liked Venom, really thought Venom 2 was quite dumb fun. This was a fucking disaster. Holy shit, this was awful. There is one bit at the end where it seems to understand what it is and tries to have fun with itself. The rest of this is just like painful blockbuster garbage. Not quite as bad as Madam Web. This is not the worst film in the Sony Spider-Man cinematic universe that doesn't have Spider-Man. But God, is it atrocious. Genuinely quite shocked by how bad this was. Tom Hardy, please do something else with your life. Remember when Tom Hardy, like a few years ago, people were like, is going to win an Oscar, and now he's doing this? Boy, how we fallen. But did not enjoy Venom 3. So that's a snapshot of what I've watched over the last few weeks. I guess I'll also mention The Faculty, which was really good. I was really actually impressed by that film. But yeah, so that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Fritz Lang. Sorry that we kind of didn't like you, but a great filmmaker. Would recommend watching most of his other works. Jack, where can we find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter and X, very barely, but you can primarily find me on Letterboxd, which I'm, again, finishing out my 64 days of Halloween this year because I'm like so dedicated to the cause and I need to see Hellraiser 9 or whatever there is. But no, you can see me that, and you can see me start doing Noir November. And then I'm doing De Palma December because Body Double's. Oh my god, how old is Body Double 50 this year? No, it's not. Is it 50? No, it's not, is it? 1984. It is, isn't it? Or is it just
that would be 50, I believe. Yeah,
that's just bad maths. But I'm going to watch his early stuff with Robert De Niro. I'm going to watch home movies that he did with Kirk Douglas. I'm going to watch the Awesome Mouse thing. I'm just going to get some stuff off the table there. So my next few months are looking good. On Letterboxd, my Rebel Ridge reviews just dropped. My Kneecap review just dropped. Love Kneecap, love Rebel Ridge. And a feature's dropping. Not really a feature, just more sort of like an emotive outpouring of like me agreeing with Joshua John Miller directing The Exorcism. I get this. Nobody else gets it. Features like basically just describing like his relationship with his dad, like having to like see his dad succumb to an illness while giving all about performance and as an actor, and essentially like 30 years of watching his dad succumb to alcoholism in the space of an hour and 30 minutes. A few little interesting digs at The Exorcist here, especially Freaking as well, which I thought was fun. But a really emotive, quite cathartic, and really personal feature to watch. And I just wanted to write something about it. I wanted to write something ever since I saw it. It's been like 3 months. I just haven't had the time. So it's not really a feature, but it'll be out there. And I'm going to try doing my Alien feature when we do the Gladiator 2, but I just got to get the time. But you can find my writing on Letterboxd, and you can find me on here a lot. I love joining Carson. Carson's really appreciative just to allow me on talk and just talk about movies that I can watch, and like what a brilliant escape it is for me. So thank you very much for joining me. You can find me on Gems every other week when they're not talking about like very like Carnosaur or something, but like slightly retrospective. You can hear my voice, and if that's too much for you, go support everyone else as well. Go listen to some Carson stuff. Jaco, Brandit, the Italian Nick. Yeah. But thank you very much for having me on. You don't have to do this every week. You can just be like, Jak, not this week. But no, you've indulged me, and I love talking about Fritz Lang with you. For both of us to watch 2 features, and we haven't seen before. I think it's quite rare on here, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you very much. It was really fun to watch it, and we've got to a conclusion, haven't we? We've come to a head here. We've got it. Yeah. But again, thank you very much.
I love it when we haven't seen it before. And we're like, I'm planning 2025 schedule, and like there's a lot of films that I don't believe either of us have seen, and that's very exciting. So it's gonna be fun.
Carson, as long as I'm there with you talking about movies, could be Barbie, it could be Rugrats. I'm not bothered. I'll Wonder Woman 1984. The poster's staying with my face now. I'll be there. So thank you very much for indulging me. Thank you very much for inviting me as well.
No worries. And you can find me on Twitter at BP_movie reviews, Letterboxd just Carson Timar. And Jak, we have reason to celebrate because yes, Fritz Lang was fun. But next week, if everything goes according to plan as far as your screening schedule, and I think Nick is joining us, Jak, next week we're reviewing Gladiator 2. Ridley Scott's film of the year. Yeah. I'm excited. Cannot wait.
I'm excited. If you'd have asked me like 2 months ago, I think we both would have been like, we'll see. It's starting to ramp up now. It's starting to be like that. Matt Ramos came out and was just glowing review. It's a film. It has costume design in it. There's something.
No, there's literally costumes, production design, even a score. It's going to be life-changing.
It does have them. It's been reviewed bombed by racists on YouTube, so you know it's going to be good because it's going to be great. Rap song, because that's never been done before, has it?
My absolute favorite quote is that someone saw an early screening and they're like a historian and they're like, this is bullshit. They read newspapers in the film. They didn't have newspapers back then. Can't wait. I'm going to give it a 5 stars for sure. So you can check that out next week, everyone. We have a big November and I'm excited for it. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.